2-week mini-series with the famous Dr. Randy Wood.
Oh, yes,
And,
famous in Cleveland. Yeah.
and so I'm just going to turn it over to you.
All right, good. I think that is on. Good. Well, I'm excited to be able to do this morning. Thanks to David asking. I haven't. Anytime I get to talk about the 16th century, it's a good day, right? And Philip, you guys set it up perfectly. We ended with Martin Luther's "A Mighty Fortress is Our God," and now we're going to talk about John Calvin, right? So, "A Mighty Fortress is Our God," just to make the transition to this morning, right? Written in 1529, right? That's the year the word Protestant, protest, right, becomes a normal word for those who are protesting, because Luther and the German princes protested against the Holy Roman Emperor. So Protestant, we can start to use that term as of 1529. And Luther writes that hymn, right? "A mighty fortress is our God," right? To defend us from potential threats, including political threats, right? Good connection to a couple Sundays on John Calvin and Geneva. I'm not going to do so much theology. I want to talk about Calvin's life and Geneva, right? And to get us thinking about Calvin and Geneva, right, I wanted to just show you a couple images and then throw a sort of quote out there just to get the mind thinking, right, about not so much about the theology, obviously that's really important, but about other things, right? The name of our church, right? Trinity, obviously, that binds all Christians across all centuries. Presbyterian, we think that's important enough to put on there, right? And yet, Presbyterian is not as important as Trinity, but we believe that Presbyterianism is very important, right? Back of our bulletin, right? Pastors, elders, deacons. We believe that organization is so important, we're willing to call our church a Presbyterian church, right? Because Presbyterians have pastors, elders, deacons, right? So Calvin is crucial in that story too. So his life and then sort of how he got to Geneva and what happened in Geneva. But again, to get your mind thinking, here's some images for us. Here's the International Monument to the Reformation in Geneva. That's called the Reformation Wall. It's about 100 yards long, right? This massive monument. There's a long shot of it, right? Dedicated to great heroes of the Reformation, especially as they relate to Geneva and Switzerland. Martin Luther is not on the wall. He gets his own little statue off to the side. It's more like this, right? So like, yes, Luther was great, but Calvin, right? Here is these four fellows here. Calvin is the second figure, the tallest one. Will Ferrell, not our Will Ferrell, but William Ferrell here, right? Can you imagine Will Ferrell on that? I mean, that would be Ricky Bobby or something, right? So Will Ferrell, John Calvin, Theodore Beza, and John Knox. So Knox, obviously, the reformer of Scotland. So Presbyterianism comes from Scotland, but it comes from Geneva, right? And Zurich and other places. But Knox is critical in this story, right? So Farrell, Calvin, Beza, and John Knox, right? And then along the wall, there are lots of other important reformers, many of them political reformers, right? So this Reformation wall, very much those who promoted liberty, right? Those who fought against tyranny, right? There are Dutch examples, right? The Dutch, William the Silent, led the Dutch against Spain, the overthrow of Spain to have Dutch independence, Dutch liberty, Dutch republicanism, and Calvinism, right? So this story, at least as it comes through Geneva, is always mixing republicanism and Calvinist theology. Republican church organization, right? We elect our representatives, right? And those representatives go to presbytery. That's republicanism, right? So this link to Geneva is a really important thing for us to sort of think about. Oliver Cromwell is on this wall as well, the Commonwealth in England, right? Roger Williams, founder of Rhode Island, right? He's on this wall too, right? So there are Americans, English, Dutch, there's a Hungarian, again, a leader of the Hungarian Reformation against the tyranny of the empire, right, is on here as well. So Geneva is an interesting place to think about, right? As this center of Calvin, right? Farel leads the way, then Calvin comes in, and then these long traditions of liberty and fighting against tyranny and church organization, pastors, elders, deacons, etc. Picture of Geneva, 1600. This would have been similar to the way Calvin would have seen Geneva. He's not from Geneva, right? He shows up sort of unexpectedly in Geneva. But this is the Geneva he would have known, would have been very similar to this, right? He dies in 1564. A large city, but not a massive city. So it's about 10,000 when Calvin shows up in 1536. About a 10,000 person city. So that's a pretty big city, right? Not as big as Paris, London, etc., but big enough to be important, right? Okay, conversation starter, just to get your minds thinking about this. Not so much about theology. Obviously, theology is very important to us, right? But this phrase, stamp of Geneva, I love this stamp. This is a historian of the previous century. He dies in the 1980s, but he described this beautifully, I think, and I put this on a quote on your handout too. So, if one were to compute such a percentage on the basis of all German, Swiss, French, Dutch, Scottish, and of course English people whose forebears bore the stamp of Geneva in some broader sense, 85 or 90% of the 1776 colonial population would not be an extravagant estimate, right? So of all the colonists, right, who are here on the eastern seaboard, right, from Massachusetts all the way down to the Carolinas, he's suggesting 85 to 90% would have the stamp of Geneva, right? Interesting, right? We don't think like that at all now, right? So I'm a teacher, I teach at Lee, right? And I always try to begin with something that doesn't sound right? What? Everybody in 1776 was connected to Calvinism? Yes, right? Probably the Bible you had would have been the Geneva Bible, right? The catechisms you were reading are the catechisms we read, right? Or some versions of those, right? Or variations, right? Oftentimes, especially the New England Puritans would take they take the Westminster Confession and sort of create their own, right? That models it. But the comments are always, let's use the Westminster Confession, right? And revise it, right? This sort of thing. What do you think about that? Just some thoughts. The stamp of Geneva, right? Dr. Coates is not here to heckle me, so, he would be heckling me, so that'd be okay, yes.
When I first heard this wasn't even a year ago, I think, it came to a surprise to me.
Yes.
Especially as me just finding out that my thoughts were, Calvinistic thoughts.
Right.
And some of the names I've been called being a Calvinist now. Every American, if you love being an American, the government set up is somewhat a Calvinist.
It's hard. It's not hard to see some connection, right? Yeah, I came to the Reformed tradition. I didn't grow up in the Reformed tradition, so I had the same experience, right? Kind of, what? Why didn't I know this, right? Why had I never thought about this before? Not that it's 100% accurate. This is a historian who's making a judgment, right? But even if it's in some way, right, reflective of the sense of if you were alive in 1775. Kind of what your life would be like, right? In terms of your thought life, probably there would be connections to Calvinism, right? There's a famous, one of the guys who fought in the battle at Concord, right? Concord Bridge. And he's late in life, he's asked by a young grad student from Harvard, you must have been reading all these political thinkers. And he says, No, I read the Bible and the catechisms. We just didn't want the British controlling us, right? Again, the Bible and the catechisms were his only reading. Yeah.
Can we look at why it changed? That's something to avoid this morning. Time-wise.
Yes, I think it'd be a great, again, I think there are a lot of great thoughts on that. I have a theory, but yeah, I think we should not get too much into that. But
I think part of it is the individualistic nature
yes,
of America
yes,
that kind of changed to more of an Arminian thing of we've got to
yes.
help God alone.
Right. 19th century is really critical for this dramatic religious shift. The Second Great Awakening, things like that. Also, just a name, and then we'll move on. But John Locke, right? Thomas Jefferson sort of plagiarized John Locke in the Declaration. Yes, but John Locke wasn't John Locke until after the war. Then, John Locke is sort of the author of liberalism, right? In the best sense of the word, right? In capitalism, individualism, all of those things bound up with liberalism and John Locke. So I think Locke wins, right, as the Christian Commonwealth tradition fades. That would be my short answer. But yeah, that'd be a lot of fun to talk about that, right? Okay, some more fun quotes to get your thoughts out there. Well, let me show you a map and give you labels. Again, here's Geneva in the center of the map, and all these arrows, right? Calvinism is often called international Calvinism because it spreads so aggressively. Again, not just theologically, but ecclesiastically, right? Protestants want to have churches like the church in Geneva, organized the way the Church of Geneva is organized in some form. And I always get mad at these maps because they kind of go around England. England is right in line with Geneva and Calvinism, but it's always in debate, right? There are so many, again, here's sort of our list, right? But there are so many debates in England, it's hard to say at any one point England is not Calvinist or it is Calvinist. About the year 1600 in England, one of the leaders of the church writes a memo to the archbishop and says, could our seminaries teach someone other than Calvin? Right? He's angry because all they're teaching at Cambridge and Oxford is John Calvin, right? And so England is always kind of in this middle, but until 1660, and then England they sort of leave the Calvinist camp partially behind. So here's sort of the stamp of Geneva, right, as it spreads out. Okay, so what does it mean? What does the stamp of Geneva mean? I didn't put these on your sheet, but these are just fun thoughts, right? When people think about the stamp of Geneva now, if they even did, as you said, you were called something interesting for believing in this. H.L. Mencken's famous statement, right, about Puritanism, the haunting fear that someone somewhere might be happy, right? Yeah, I mean, 1920s, right, okay. But this if people think about outside our circles, right, Calvinism, Puritanism, etc., Presbyterianism, this is more of what they're going to think about, right? Puritanism as constraining, Puritanism, Calvinism, Presbyterianism as narrow, legalistic, etc., right? And in American schools, right, the Scarlet Letter and the Crucible are two of the main vehicles for knowledge about the New England Puritans, right? Again, as an extension of Calvinism, right, our understanding of Calvinism. The Crucible, right? So John Coates and I got to teach a class together, a sort of government-sponsored class a few years ago, and the primary reading for New England Puritanism was The Crucible, right? It's like, it's a good play, but it's not about the Puritans, it's about the 1950s, right? But The Crucible, you know, the Salem witch trials and all of this, that's what I would think most people, if they know something about the Puritans, they might know The Crucible, right? Or the Scarlet Letter, Nathaniel Hawthorne, right? Any thoughts on again, now again, within our circles, we're more familiar with other trends and ideas, but what's your average person think about, right? Calvinism, Presbyterianism, Puritanism? Yes.
Growing up Catholic, I remember reading
Yes.
That became my motto of Presbyterianism and Puritanism in my head.
Right, right.
Oh, that poor person on the side of the road, yeah, they're the reprobate.
Right.
That was in my head.
Yes, yes. Yeah, that, again, Hawthorne's an amazing author, but yeah, I mean, his ancestor, right, Judge Hawthorne, right, without a W. But that shapes our opinions, right, of this type of person, this type of society, when I think there's some other things we should think about, right? Other thoughts on the crucible, or just, when you think about, when the average person is asked about Puritanism, Calvinism, Presbyterianism, etc., right? Geneva, what might come up?
Well, they talk about it like Calvin's the one that invented his teaching, especially on doctrine, which he was, as far as I know, was just one of the best that was ever to articulate the Bible.
Right, right. So very much from within the Reformation, we would say there's a recovery of biblical truth, absolutely. Not so much an invention, right? Geneva, right, being strict, right? And I always, say, where is it illegal to play cards in Europe? Let's go back to Europe, right? Not just in Geneva, but everywhere, right? Where is adultery a crime, right? Not just in Boston or Geneva, everywhere, right? Adultery's always been a crime, a punishable crime, right? Until the late 1800s, right? Where is it illegal not to go to church, right, on Sunday? Everywhere, right? Again, so we think of Boston or Geneva or, as these strict cities, but they're not doing anything unusual. They are enforcing things, right? That might be unusual, right? But in no country in Europe can you say, Sunday morning, I don't want to go to church today, right? Now, you might say that and get away with it, fine, right? But no one is saying, you could wake up and say, I don't feel like going to church today, right? So Boston and Geneva aren't different in that sense, except that they are enforcing these things, right? Okay. Other thoughts? Yes?
I grew up as a Second-day Adventist.
Yes.
So the only time I ever heard of Calvinism or John Calvin was in a very negative sense. Stay
Yes.
away from that.
Right.
So that's the attitude that I had
Right.
the majority of my life. And then, like in 1920 and 21, when I couldn't go to church, and I had become a Baptist by that time.
Okay.
And I started reading church history. I read 4 volumes about that big.
Yes, all right.
Needham's books on
Okay.
church history, and I read the Institutes just because I needed something to do. And it shocked me. Here I am, 75 years old, that I had never heard any of these truths in my life.
Right.
No sermon ever in any church I've been to had ever preached the truths that I was learning then. So the last 4 years have been very upheaval in my life.
Mm.
And I would like to recommend an ebook, Monergism.
Monergism, yes.
Yeah, because it's really old books, and so I've gotten into reading those in the last
Right.
few months. That you can learn so much when you go back and read the old guys.
Yes, I totally agree. My experience was similar, right? Not active hostility towards Calvinism, but definitely stay away from it. That sort of that was my youth and teenage and early college years.
While you're sharing stories, Randy, I grew up in the Church of God, and our youth leader at the church in Richmond that I was part of said one day, he said, there are Arminians and there are Calvinists, and we're Arminians. End of discussion.
End of discussion,
There
right.
was no definition of terms or anything, and I didn't know what the difference was until much, much later.
Right. And I'm happy to, the Trinity, right, is this big, right, and as we get smaller, but these are things worth discussing, right? It's not just a open and shut, or I think there are a lot of things to discuss. Yes.
Going back to the Geneva example.
Yes. Right. Good.
So maybe this is my modern mind that's been
Yes.
by how quickly things change.
Right.
But why wasn't there a change
Yeah, super question. I think there was change between, say, 1560 and 1760, but in the colonies, I think there is more continuity overall, right? Maybe the first Great Awakening has some things to do with that, right? Whitefield and all those guys. That would, again, be sort of the short answer. But between 1560 and 1760, the Enlightenment is rising, right? And we have our first atheist for the first, people can stand up in 1750 and say, I'm an atheist. You can't do that before 1750, right? So things are changing, but I think the fruit of it shows up post-revolution in America very strongly. Yeah, go with this. Good question. Okay, so let me flip the script then. If we tend to think of Calvinism as constricting and in terms of outward activities and rules and regulations, Geneva, Boston, Puritans, for many years, right, for a long time, right, this was more of the attitude, right? Jean-Jacques Rousseau, I seldom quote him favorably, but he's from Geneva, right? And he recognized a different piece, right? That there's something about liberty and patriotism with Calvin, right? Those who consider Calvin only as a theologian fail to recognize the breadth of his genius. The editing of our wise laws, in which he had a large share, does him as much credit as his institutes. So long as love of country and liberty is not extinct among us, the memory of this great man will be held in reverence. Written in the 1760s, right? Again, held in reverence. Calvin is not held in reverence by much of the modern world, right? But Rousseau, at least, thought it would, as long as we valued liberty. He's speaking specifically of Geneva, but. And of course, Presbyterianism, right? Some fun statements. These are just more for fun, right? Presbyterianism was considered radical, right? All through kind of Anglo-American history and European history. The term Calvian was used by ambassadors to refer to anyone who was a Republican. Now, a Republican, little r, is someone who wants to overthrow monarchy, right? So the shorthand for someone who wants to overthrow monarchs was Calvian, right? That's how radical, right, Geneva was. But so these are statements all around the American Revolution, right? The British Secretary of State, Lord Dartmouth, reports to the government, right, that Presbyterianism is the cause of the American Revolution. Right? George III, when he's asked about the Bostonian agitation against Hutchinson, right? He simply says, aren't they Presbyterians, right? Of course they're going to rebel. That's what they do, right? That's what Presbyterians do. Are they not Presbyterians, right? And again, a typical comment in a London newspaper, this is picked out just because it's commonplace, right? Presbyterians are causing this trouble, that restless and turbulent anti-monarchical spirit, which has always distinguished them everywhere, right? So, those of you who are younger, you might think Presbyterians radical, right? No, we're not radical at all. But in political terms, right, and think of European history, right, there's this link between a belief in government that is not connected to aristocracy and royalty, and government that is of the people, by the people, for the people. Geneva is a wonderful example of an attempt at that, right? And so it will be revered for its ecclesiastical system and political system, and Calvin was a participant in both of those systems. Now, I'm not saying they're right? Of course, that, it's not that we have to believe, Presbyterians are radical. I'm just suggesting that this is in the mind of many, and it would not be now, right? We would not. I doubt anyone taking a class on the American Revolution would hear that Presbyterianism is the cause of the war, right? So I think that has changed. That's part of that change, right? Any thoughts about these statements, these fun statements?
Well, I take offense at the idea that we're anti-monarch. Yeah.
That is what monarchs believe. Like King James I says it, right? And he,
But if we could have
right?
a perfect king,
Yes.
we'd
Yes. Yes.
We do have a perfect king.
Yes, right. Great point, right? When John Knox goes a little extreme in his attack on Queens, Calvin criticizes him and says, "Okay, don't be too harsh," right? So, but yeah, even James I says, right, Presbyterianism and monarchy cannot go together, right? I mean, I would agree, of course, our true king, right? Yes.
On one of the last slides,
Yes.
when it mentions Calvin helping to revise some of the civil laws of Geneva.
Oh, right,
Do
right.
you have any examples of some of the changes that he made?
Yes, and that will be next Sunday. Yes, yes. So we'll get to Geneva today, and we'll kind of like Calvin arrives, and then we'll do what Geneva looks like while he's there. Yes, exactly. Great. Okay, so let's look at Calvin's life and get him to Geneva. He's not from Geneva. He's French, right? Born north of Paris, and again, not far with Noyon. And his dad is a business manager. That's the best title for him. His dad, Gerard, works for the cathedral. His town, Noyon, is a cathedral town. The cathedrals are big businesses, right? So there's a business manager. He's a lawyer. He's everything sort of that business manager would do. So Gerard says, let's get you set up with a life in the church. So he sends his son to the University of Paris, age 13-ish, right, somewhere in there. He goes to Montague College, one of the best theology schools. Erasmus had studied there. Later, Voltaire will study there. Both Erasmus and Voltaire hated it. Calvin loved it, right? He studied theology, scholastic theology, traditional theology, with a new dose of Christian humanism. Humanism in this century is about recovering ancient texts and recovering ancient languages, not so much about elevating human dignity above the divine, anything like that, right? So he's excited, he loves it. He finishes his MA about age 18 and is really set up for this career in the church, right? That's the plan. But his dad gets in arguments with the church, and he actually gets excommunicated. And so his dad's kind of fed up with the church, right? And says, I've got a different idea. How about law school, right? So if you know anything about Luther's history, it's the opposite of Luther, right? Luther is, Luther's dad, law, law, law. And then Luther comes home and says, I'm going to join the church. And dad's not happy about that. Here it's the reverse. Gerard is like, church. And then changes his mind and says, how about law school? So age 18 or so, Calvin heads off to law school at Orleans. Loves it again. Again, because of the type of professors that are there, sweeping Europe is what we would call sort of the new movement of legal humanism. Same sort of thing, right? Let's get back to studying all the ancient laws, right? Let's go back as far as we can and recover Roman law and ancient traditions in Europe, right? And use the languages necessary to understand those laws. So Greek and Latin, of course, right? But Greek especially is kind of new in Europe, right? You can't take a Greek class at Oxford until now, the 1500s or late 1400s. You can't take a Greek class at Cambridge, right? But now you can. So this is kind of new, right? And his teacher, one of his teachers at Orleans is a fellow named Volmar, who is an evangelical, right? Luther's ideas are spreading throughout the 1520s, right? Evangelical refers to sort of Lutherans, right, or Lutheran ideas that are spreading. Luther said we are evangelicals, right? So Volmar is an evangelical. This is, again, he's there 1528, 29, 30. So he studies closely with this fellow. And we think, it's again hard to piece these together because people don't write their diaries or memoirs. Probably this is the turning point in his intellectual development. He's getting exposed to evangelical ideas while he's studying Greek, right? While he's studying Roman law. He's also getting personal counseling about faith and justification by grace through faith, right? And this is starting to come into his vocabulary, we think, right? So he finishes up there 1531. His dad passes away in 1531 as well. Now he's got kind of a choice, a turning point in his young life, right? He's early 20s. Do I pursue a legal career? I finished all my work. I finished law school. But man, I'm loving this Greek stuff, right? Dad passes away, right? And Dad was pushing law really hard. So he goes back home and he says, I want to keep studying this sort of humanistic like languages and literature surrounding languages. So he decides not to pursue a legal career. He's all trained, he's all ready, right? He's all set. But he decides, I'm going to try something a little different than law. I'm going to stick with this sort of literary language pursuit. So he goes back to Paris and enrolls at the College of France, a brand new college. Right? This has royal patronage. King Francis I just set this up. And its original name was the College of Three Languages. It was to study Hebrew, Greek, and Latin. So it's all about language and therefore literature. And he's loving this, we think, right? He thinks this is kind of his newfound love. Early 20s, maybe this is sort of where he should head, right? His first publication comes out here, right? He publishes a commentary on Seneca's On Mercy, De Clementia, right? On mercy, on clemency. And this is a very humanistic thing to do, to take Seneca, who's a Stoic philosopher, and translate him, right? A new translation with commentary, right? This is a typical humanist project. Let's do Plato, let's do Aristotle, let's do Seneca, let's do Cicero, that sort of thing. So this might be his sort of trajectory, right? And at the new college, right, in Paris, it's new, it has royal patronage, there are humanists. Again, humanist is a good word in this century, right? Again, probably several of these teachers are evangelical or leaning, right? We've heard of Luther, we kind of like Luther, right? So we think his ideas continue to grow here. And then crisis hits, right? Crisis and conversion, or conversion as crisis, we don't know, right? Somewhere between 1531 and 34, Calvin has his true conversion, right? And it is an experience. We're just not sure exactly when. So let me tell you the crisis first, then we'll backtrack to conversion. Crisis comes at a university, no surprise. University of Paris, massive university, right? His friend, he had developed a friendship with a guy named Nicholas Kopp. Kopp was becoming an evangelical, kind of ahead of Calvin, or together. They were friends, they were growing together, they were reading together. Kopp is the rector at the University of Paris, a pretty high position, right? Someone who influences policy in the direction of the school. We were talking about that before Sunday school started, right? That someone has to sort of shape the policies of the school. Well, Kopp is influential, right? And Kopp gives the convocation address, right? Convocation is at the beginning of the semester, kind of the opening ceremonies, opening lectures, opening sermons, right? And he says, that guy Erasmus, that Christian humanist who's been attacking priests and popes and bishops, he's right. Then he says, that guy Luther, he's right, right? Evangelicals spouting justification by faith, right? They're right. He even quotes the king's sister, Marguerite of Navarre. He quotes her. She's living in South France. She's a proto-Protestant. She's criticized by the church for promoting grace, right, in her works. She's the king's sister, and yet she's attacked. He quotes her, right, Margaret of Navarre. So Kopp's doing all this, right? There's a suspicion that Calvin helped write it. He ghost wrote it. They wrote it together. Regardless, they are connected. Kopp is attacked, criticized, and condemned by the theology faculty at the Sorbonne, right, the University of Paris. And they have to flee, right? So Kopp and Calvin leave Paris under duress, right? They have to escape Paris. 1534, I'm not sure where Kopp is, but Calvin is at a friend's house near the coast of France. He went there because they had a good library, right? So he could read at least, right? Kind of a theme in his life. I'm going to go wherever there are books, right? So he goes, seeks out this friend, and spends 1534 there, maybe thinking that things will die down, right, and he could probably get back. But at the same time, right, that he's kind of waiting this out, a big political crisis hits. Evangelicals in Paris, at the university and around, right, decide they're going to cause controversy. They're going to protest. This is called the Affair of the Placards, right? It's an attack on Mass, right? The ceremony of Mass, right? The liturgical element of the Mass. They produce flyers, right? And they go around Paris sticking these flyers up everywhere, right? Even, right, the story goes, they make it into the king's personal private spaces in the Louvre. The Louvre is the main palace for the king. They go into his bedroom and stick these on his bedposts, right? The Mass is satanic, right? The horrible, great, intolerable abuses of the papal Mass. Mass was execrable blasphemy, pretending to be a sacrifice of God, right? So these are on posters and placards all over Paris, right? Are things going to calm down in Paris? No, right? So there's no going back to Paris in 1534, right? So this really is a crisis period, right? Calvin's a young scholar. He wants to write books. He wants to read Greek and Hebrew, and he's not interested in controversy, but controversy has found him, right? So from 33, 34 on, he is sort of traveling, right, and wandering around Europe. Somewhere in here, we can't pinpoint it, he has this personal conversion experience, right? And it's pretty profound. So it doesn't really matter exactly when it happened, right? Sometime 31, 32, 33, somewhere in there. He only tells us about it in 1557. So this is a memory, a reflection, right? This is on the back side of the handout if you can read that more easily. But so this is all he ever really tells us about his conversion, right? To this pursuit, study of law, I endeavored faithfully to apply myself in obedience to the will of my Father. So maybe this is closer to 1531, right? But God, by the secret guidance of his providence, at length gave a different direction to my course. At first, since I was too obstinately devoted to the superstitions of popery to be easily extricated from so profound an abyss of more, God, by a sudden conversion, subdued and brought my mind to a teachable frame, which was more hardened in such matters than might have been expected from one at my early period of life. Having thus received some taste and knowledge of true godliness, I was immediately inflamed with so intense a desire to make progress therein, that although I did not altogether leave off my other studies, I pursued them with less ardor. So whatever it is he's studying, is it law, or maybe he's into this literature period, he says, I kept studying those things, but pursued them less passionately. I don't know, this is just a great statement, right? Any thoughts on that? I think we heard in the early service about hard hearts, right? Calvin's conversion is so powerful, right? God subdued, right? And brought my mind to a teachable frame. Again, just thoughts about this conversion statement, right? And it's pretty powerful. In my own life, right? In terms of resonating with my own hardness of heart and God acting aggressively, right? To subdue. It's just a powerful image.
Randy, that statement there about I was immediately inflamed with so intense a desire to make progress there.
Yes,
Really came to my mind hungering and thirsting after righteousness.
it does. It does. Yeah.
And the promise that's associated with that we will be.
We will.
We do hunger.
Yes. Might not always be even in our passion and in our desire to make progress, but it's always there, right? Yes.
As a lifelong Protestant, I really like the phrase superstitions of popery.
That's right. Popery was the phrase, right? So yeah. The language of the 16th century is really fun, right? And this is cleaned up a bit, but it is very aggressive and right. So yeah, popery is a good summary, right, statement. The superstitions of popery, and he was right, in this abyss, right. Any other thoughts on his conversion, right? I think just a good, his lifelong motto and seal, not adopted till sometime in the 1540s probably, but he always would, his motto, I offer my heart to thee, O Lord, promptly and sincerely. And this is his seal that becomes common, right? A hand with a heart, offering that heart to God. Or God is holding his heart, right? But okay, so 1534, Paris is in chaos. He can't go back to Paris, right? What can he do? Again, he sort of decides he'll travel around Europe to Protestant cities, or cities that are becoming evangelical or already have become evangelical, and get some advice, right? What should I do? How should I live? How should I write? How should I teach? These sorts of things. Strasbourg, he heads to Strasbourg first, right on the German-French border. Lots of folks there, right? Martin Butzer, who was an early supporter of Luther. Strasbourg has become fully Protestant. Matthew and Catherine Zell, the Zell family is there. They're, again, very influential in Protestant circles in Calvin's life. Then he goes to Basel from there, and again, Erasmus is there. Erasmus is really old by this point, but he gets to talk to Erasmus, gets to meet Erasmus. Heinrich Bullinger is there. Bullinger will sort of take over reforms in Zurich from Zwingli, right? So when Zwingli dies, Bullinger will become kind of the leader of the Zurich Reformation. So he's meeting everybody who's anybody, right, in the Protestant world. Then he gets a job offer in Italy, at Ferrara. The Duchess of Ferrara is French royalty. She's been given this title. She's a cousin of the king, and she marries a duke in Italy who's connected to the Borgias and all those families down there. But she is evangelical. So she says, come down here, we'll kind of set up a sort of an evangelical Protestant, well, not an academy, but kind of a working group, right? That sort of thing. And refugees can come here, and we can talk all things Luther, all things evangelical, all things biblical. She's excited. Her husband, not so much, right? So he gets down there. He's only down there 4 or 6 weeks or so, and her husband's like, this isn't going to happen, right? You're not going to have a Protestant heresy club down here, right? So he has to get out fast, right? So I bring her name up because she's really important in France later for helping Huguenots and Calvinists who are refugees throughout Europe, right? So she becomes really important in France as a Protestant, right? But he can't stay there, right, in 1534, 5, 6. This is when all this is happening. So what does he do now, right? He's going to head back to Paris, get his brother and sister, and just get out, right? All right, just for your amazement, right? During this period of running around Europe, he writes the Institutes of the Christian Religion, right? I just was sitting down one afternoon and wrote it, right? I mean, he's traveling, he's running around Europe, right? Trying to figure out what to do with his life and how to do it. And he writes the Institutes. The first version is small, so that at least helps us understand that. He is superhuman, but maybe not, 6 chapters. By 1559, the final edition has 80 chapters, right? So this expands. It's his life's work, right? So for the next 30 years, right, he's working on that. So he publishes that, which instantly makes him famous. So he leaves Ferrara, publishes the Institutes, right? And then this gets him to Geneva, right? Okay, 1536, he's got his brother and his sister. He went back to Paris, but he can't stay there. The king had just issued an edict that says you've got about 6 months to decide if you're a heretic or not for all French people. So he's going to get out, right? So he's going to go to Strasbourg. Strasbourg is his dream. He says, I just want a little corner to work in. That's all I want. Give me a corner. Give me a little library. Give me a cubbyhole. He can't get to Strasbourg. There's a war going on between Germany and France. The route to Strasbourg is blocked, so he goes to Geneva, right? He gets to Geneva. He's there 24 hours. Will Ferrell is there, and Will Ferrell hears Calvin's in town. He finds Calvin, right, and says, you must help me reform Geneva. Calvin says, no, I'm looking for a little library somewhere. I want to write books. Farrell says, if you don't stay, God will condemn you. You ever heard of Jonah, right? Okay, he does. He pulls out the Jonah card, right? Farrell pulls out the Jonah card, right? And Calvin says, I felt a weight so heavy on me from God that I had to stay. So he stays in Geneva, doesn't want to be there, didn't plan to go there. He was planning to write books in a library somewhere. He ends up in Geneva, and Farrell had already been working there. Farrell's a go-getter. He's been reforming Switzerland left and right. The people he was working for in Bern sent him to Geneva to get them to reform. Then Calvin shows up in 1536, right? And again, Neuchâtel, already reformed by Farrell. Bern is being reformed by Farrell. Now Geneva is going to be reformed by Farrell. But Calvin shows up, and Farrell says, you're 20 years younger than me. Let's do this together, right? Calvin does not want to be there, but he says, okay, I'll stay, right? So Calvin commits to Geneva at this point. And Geneva becomes the story of his life, right? It's really difficult, right? Last point, because we need to stop, right? Last point. Geneva had just had a revolution. They just overthrew their bishop and declared themselves a republic. So the Republic of Geneva, and we're trying to make Geneva Protestant at the same time, right? So Republican Geneva, Protestant Geneva happening simultaneously, right? Okay, we'll start there next week then. All right. Thanks for your attention. That was fun. Anytime I get to talk about the 16th century, I'll do it, right? So, all right. It was a stopping time, right? 11? Okay, good. Okay. Thank you. You're welcome. Let's see. I do not know how to turn it off.
Well,
I'll put it to the side. Here we go.
say, Philip, here's that copy of that.
Oh, yeah.
Promise to get it to you.
Yeah, no, thank you.
Yeah, I think you find it rather intriguing.
Yeah, no, I look forward to reading it for sure.
Yeah. He has